Thanks for joining us today. My name is Petra McGowan, and I am the Program Manager for the Nature Conservancy's Reef Resilience Program and your host for today's webinar. This webinar was developed and supported in partnership with the Biodiversity Project of the Indian Ocean Commission. Today's webinar will be 1 hour and 25 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. If you're having technical difficulties, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides, you can send us a message via the chat box, and we'll try and resolve the issue. Also, you can use the question box anytime throughout the webinar to send questions, and we'll keep track of these for the end of the presentation. I'm just going to do a quick audio check with our presenters. David, can you let me know if you're hearing me all right real quick?
Yes, I can hear you great, Petra.
Great, okay. So right now I'd like to introduce and welcome our presenters, David Obura and Mishal Gudka. David is the director of CORDIO East Africa, which supports coral reef and marine activities in mainland Africa and the Indian Ocean. David received his PhD from the University of Miami on coral bleaching and life history strategies. His other areas of work include the development of participatory monitoring and research tools with artisanal fishers in East Africa and remote reef surveys, such as in the Phoenix Islands, Central Pacific, Central and Western Indian Ocean. He also chairs IUCN's Coral Specialist Group and the Climate Change and Coral Reefs Working Group. Our other presenter today is Mishal Gudka. He's currently working for the Indian Ocean Commission's Biodiversity Program to develop and strengthen national and regional capacities to monitor and respond to coral bleaching in the Western Indian Ocean. He has actively participated in regional coral reef bleaching response efforts, including data gathering, reporting through CORDIO and the Global Coral Reef Monitoring Network. He holds a Master of Science in Applied Ecology and Conservation from the University of East Anglia and has worked on marine conservation efforts in Zanzibar and southern Kenya. So thank you both for presenting, and I will now pass it over to you, David.
Okay, thank you, Petra. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess it's afternoon for most people attending the webinar. There could be other time zones if you're from much farther afield than the Western Indian Ocean. I'm just waiting to get the screen so I can put the presentation up for everybody to see.
Did it come through, David?
No, it hasn't come through yet. I don't.
Okay, let me try this other one.
I don't have the main screen yet. If you give us a moment, everybody will be with you. Okay, here we go. Okay, so my screen should be up.
Yep.
On the webinar. Okay, so thank you, everybody. So I'll be giving this presentation with Mishal Gudka, sitting here in our CORDIO office in Mombasa. And for many of you, I can't actually see the names on the webinar, but I think many of you are familiar. You probably were with us in the webinar we did at the beginning of the year in January on coral bleaching response plans. And I'm sure we've interacted in other ways as well in the region. So nice to talk to you all, and I look forward to the question session so I can hear who's up there. So we're going to give an overview of the 2016 coral bleaching event in the West Indian Ocean, and then move that into discussions around bleaching management plans and bleaching response plans. So we'll keep the presentation relatively short, to about 25 minutes, and then the second half of the hour will be for questions. An overview of our presentation is on this slide, and Mishal will give the first part of the presentation, the introduction to coral bleaching and overview of what happened in the region, and the reporting of bleaching observations that we got from many of you who are on the webinar, I'm sure, and then a range of others. And from that, we'll move into examples of the main bleaching response plans that have been active this year and some lessons learned from that for planning for subsequent years of bleaching response plans. So I think at this point, I'll hand over to Mishal to continue with this part of the presentation.
Thanks, David. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar. Thanks very much for joining us. So I'll start with a introduction to the webinar and just briefly go over the aims that we hope to achieve today. So firstly, we're going to provide an overview of the 2016 coral bleaching event in the Western Indian Ocean. We'll follow this by detailing some actual bleaching response plans that were undertaken in 2016 in the Western Indian Ocean, followed by providing some recommendations for managers in the region to prepare and deal with future mass bleaching events, and then provide participants an opportunity to explore potential areas to improve, raise issues, raise any issues, concerns, and questions that they may have regarding bleaching management. So to begin with, I'll start with what is coral bleaching and a very brief overview of that. So coral bleaching refers to a phenomenon that occurs when corals expel their symbiotic algae, zooxanthellae, which live in their tissues, due to stress. And this causes them to turn completely white or pale. Corals generally do this as a response to changes in their environment or conditions. It's a weakened state, as the zooxanthellae is the main nutritional source for most corals, so it's quite a weakened and stressed state for the coral. However, the coral are not actually dead at this stage, they're just bleached and white. And they have the chance to recover if the conditions which cause them to be bleached return back to normal within a suitable period of time. Then corals can recover back to a healthy state. However, if the stress that caused them to bleach continues over a longer period of time, between 6 to 12 weeks sometimes, the chances of recovery reduce substantially. So, regarding coral bleaching or mass coral bleaching, only one factor can cause mass coral bleaching, which has the potential to affect and impact entire regions. And this is an increase in sea surface temperatures above the long-term maximum average. So as little as a 1 to 2 degree increase is enough to cause mass bleaching over a large scale. And the duration and intensity determine how strong or severe the impact of bleaching will be. So now I'd like to take you to an overview of the 2016 Western Indian bleaching event, and specifically the climatic conditions and how they've changed over the year. So as you see in the bar chart at the top left-hand side, 2014 and 2015 were the two hottest years experienced. And then 2016 was predicted to be even hotter, and actually it ended up that in the local summer in the Western Indian Ocean, it was the hottest year, or hottest summer. This was as a result of the two subsequent years being very hot, as well as the El Nino, which occurred towards the end of 2015, which exacerbated the temperatures in 2016. So if you see then on the right-hand side of the screen, the satellite images provided by NOAA, and they show the temperature anomaly, the sea surface temperature trend, and the bleaching outlook. If you look at the sea surface trend graph or picture, you can see that the hotspots, so the hotter colors indicate higher temperatures, and you can see the hotspots, the red areas shifting northwards from January to March and moving further north. So that obviously goes with the season, and then there was the resulting temperature increase around Tanzania and Seychelles in March. So now I'll move on to what CORDIO East Africa as an organization has done in response to this 2016 bleaching event. So CORDIO has been sending out coral bleaching alerts since 2007 and conducting bi-week. So these alerts are bi-weekly regional bleaching alerts for the Western Indian Ocean. And it's generally only sent out during the hottest summer months when bleaching is at its highest, or the threat of bleaching is at its highest. They also this year specifically, CORDIO's established a bleaching reporting form in collaboration with partners in Tanzania. So the aim of the form was to provide a tool for people across the region or partners across the region to submit their bleaching observations. And then this would enable CORDIO to collect a data set in a consistent manner. We also set up a bleaching email address, which was specifically for bleaching issues and concerns. So we received quite a few observations through the email, and we were also able to send out our alert and remind partners to send in their bleaching observations from that. So now I'll move on to the monthly progression of bleaching in the Western Indian Ocean. So this map can be found on CORDIO's website using the link shown, and all these images were taken from that map. So you can see all the various months, first 7 months of this year, and each point represents a bleaching observation that was submitted to CORDIO. The different colors represent the different level of bleaching indicated at each site. So green means that there was no bleaching at that site. Yellow means there was a low level of bleaching, so that's 1 to 10% of the coral cover was bleached. Medium, which is orange, means that 10 to 50% of the coral cover was bleached. High, 50 to 90%, and extreme, greater than 90%. So you can clearly see that in March and April of this year, there was an increase in the number of observations, which indicated high or extreme levels of bleaching at their surveyed sites. So that was a clear indication of the peak of the bleaching. After April 2016, the incidences of high bleaching sites reduced, and we've also received fewer observations as the seasons progressed. So now going on to our first result charts. We received over 680 observations through the bleaching report form as well as through emails from the region. And these two pie charts show a breakdown of observations. The left-hand side refers to bleaching between January and May, and mortality is on the right since April 2016. So once again, the different categories are green, indicating no bleaching, yellow and low, indicating a low level of bleaching, 1 to 10%. Orange is medium, 10 to 50% of the coral cover was bleached. High is red and indicates 50 to 90%, and maroon is extreme, greater than 90%. So on the left-hand side, you can see that 28.9% of the bleaching observations we received between January and May indicated that there was high level of bleaching at that site, or at those sites. So that's quite a high percentage. So over 32% of the observations we received indicated that there was high or extreme bleaching at their sites. The mortality, this doesn't necessarily translate into mortality, direct mortality, because you can see the mortality is quite a lot lower. There's less than 10% of the mortality, less than 10% of the observations showed high or extreme mortality. So it tends to indicate that a lot of the high-level bleaching sites recovered and did not result in high levels of mortality. So now I'll show you this bar chart for the island territories in the Western Indian Ocean. So there's two columns per territory. The left-hand side is bleaching and the right is mortality. And again, these indicate the percentage of observations that we received and what level of bleaching there were. So again, red indicates high, extreme is maroon, orange is medium, low is yellow, and green is none. So that if we take Seychelles as an example, the high level of bleaching, or red, so there's around 30%. So 30% of the observations from Seychelles indicated that there was a high level of bleaching at their surveyed sites. And if you look at, for example, Reunion, there was about 25% of the total number of observations received from Reunion indicated a high level of bleaching. So once again, it's something that's quite clear to see in these maps, in these columns, is that for each territory, the high levels of bleaching or extreme levels of bleaching didn't necessarily translate into high levels of mortality. So for some countries like Mauritius, there were actually no records provided of indicating high levels of mortality. And for all the rest, they were much lower than the bleaching. For mainland territories, that's South Africa, Madagascar, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Kenya. Again, there's the same trend between bleaching and mortality, where you have some countries like Tanzania that had quite a number of records of showing high levels of bleaching. However, their mortality didn't produce the same. So this tends to suggest that there's quite a large number of sites that recovered from their high levels of bleaching. Kenya, for example, did not exhibit any sites, or did not have any sites with high or extreme levels of mortality. So we also managed to group the results into different protected area types. So we have 3 different protected area types. So we have government protected sites on the left. In the middle, there's various different forms of protection. So that includes community conservation areas, private marine reserves, other marine reserves as well. And then on the right, we have just unprotected sites. So there's a similar pattern here as well, where you have, for example, the protected sites which are government protected. There's about 35%, just over 35% of the observations received from these sites indicated a high level of bleaching, whereas the mortality is quite different. There's only very few sites that had high levels of mortality, and it's the same across the board. So to conclude on these results, it's quite clear to see that there's a high geographic variation within the region. Seychelles and Tanzania were some of the most heavily impacted in terms of bleaching. So there's this very narrow band of around 6 degrees or 5 degrees latitude, which is Zanzibar, northern Tanzania, and Seychelles, granitic islands that experience high levels of bleaching. However, these high levels of bleaching did not necessarily result in high levels of mortality. So we've received recently some reports from Tanzania and from sites that recorded high levels of bleaching, and they have stated that a lot of the coral has recovered quite well, and there's now low levels of mortality at these sites. So the high level of bleaching earlier in the year didn't necessarily result in high levels of mortality. It would be great if for those of us who are attending this webinar, if it is possible to revisit sites that you submitted data for high levels of bleaching, and revisit those sites now and see whether there was high levels of mortality or whether there was good levels of recovery. So there's a number of reasons why we didn't see this resulting high mortality from the high bleaching, which are listed there. But so for now, it seems like we were lucky this year regarding coral mortality, but we never know for how long and whether the next event will actually result in higher levels of mortality. So I'm going to pass it back to David now, who will take you through the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Mishal. I will just note one thing I didn't catch earlier when we were editing some of the slides, is we put Madagascar with the mainland countries. And the reason why is because Madagascar as an island is really, it's a fragment of Africa, so it's really a continental landmass, so it's a very large island. And the area of reefs in Madagascar is quite similar to the area of reefs in, more on the mainland countries than the small island states, so that's why we moved it there. I'm sure there might be some questions about that. But moving forward, what I'll do is just try and relate these results to some of the management and applications. So this table summarizes the groups that provided the most consistent reporting of bleaching from all the various groups that responded. And if you look, there are two things that are clear from this. One is looking at the right-hand column, the type of monitoring programs. These are really places where basically they're relatively small sites where there's a lot of investments, mainly through NGOs and supporting governments and community efforts, and with resources on the coastline and nearby to do regular monitoring, whether it's twice or once a month over several months, or even on a bi-weekly or two-weekly basis. But there are not many locations in which we really have the capacity to have regular reporting like this. It would be really good. One of the take-home lessons from this is the need to really build up regular monitoring in other locations, particularly in government-supported sites where resources might be very limited. This slide on tips for preparing a bleaching response plan. Now, the arrows here are taken from the presentations that were prepared in the past about the time frame. And it would be very useful at each of the sites, and we encourage each program to really evaluate your response to the bleaching this year and use that learning to strengthen an annual plan, or a perennial plan that you'll activate each year based on the timeline below. It's really important to integrate bleaching response like this with an existing monitoring protocol, and I think the sites that were most committed to bleaching responses are also investing a lot in monitoring. But also the bleaching response has to be based on your resource availability. And at the beginning of the year, we did advocate for regular monitoring once every 2 weeks or once every month. But in the end, with the challenges of getting in the water during this peak period of bleaching in March and April, would be, if you can only go out twice, it's really important to go at the peak time of bleaching in your local area, and then also in May or June after the end of the bleaching event, and once the bleaching has nearly stopped, so that you can tell whether corals are recovering or have died. Then applying the findings from this bleaching response to management, and for many years, especially with and many of you may have participated in the Reef Resilience seminars, in which we really go over how to adapt management responses around the resilience of coral reefs to bleaching, looking at factors that affect their resistance to bleaching, whether they survive bleaching and corals recover, and then also the recovery afterwards if there's been mass mortality. And there's a list, we provide a list of factors over here, which I think many of you have seen before, about the first two components, so resisting and surviving the bleaching event itself, so things that cool the water down, so upwelling and water movement, shading and screening that reduces light stress at the same time as temperature stress, the health of the corals prior to the bleaching event in relation to pollution such as water quality issues, and a few other factors there. And the importance and the value of the bleaching response plan is that in actually looking at the state of a reef in real time, you can use that knowledge to influence some management actions, particularly things like giving higher protection to reefs that are currently undergoing bleaching, so they're stressed, considering short-term bans on activities that might stress the corals even further, whether that's visitation or if it's things like dredging or water quality impacts, to manage fishing pressures. And the great value of the bleaching response plans, particularly if you have stakeholders going out and collecting observations, is the communications and the awareness that you can raise locally and nationally around the issue of coral bleaching. So it's very important that all decisions, particularly if they're decisions about stopping activities during bleaching events, that these decisions are made through careful consultation, communication with stakeholders, so they're aware of the reasons why and they've participated in understanding what's happening right now. In terms of management strategies that can be used to improve a reef's chances to recover after the mortality, particularly based on the results we're getting in at this time, at the end of the bleaching event. So this can help to protect or prioritize key sites that have not bleached, and they can help with recovery of other locations by acting as larval sources. So identifying those and building them into management plans is important. And then for those that have suffered mortality and need to recover, to reduce local stresses to give corals the best chance of recovery. And I think water quality control is one of the most important things to give corals the best chance of surviving against competition from algae in the microbial community that are fertilized by pollution. And things like limiting dredging and medium-term initiatives such as managing herbivores to maintain herbivory. Looking into proposals to accelerate natural recovery processes should be a big area of interest for active restoration, and of course there's some projects doing that in the region already. And then improving resilience through the design of marine protected areas, thinking about connectivity and the spatial aspects of where they are on the coastline and how they link to one another. Invasive species control is not a big issue yet in the region, but it could grow, especially with reefs bleaching frequently. And then, of course, again, sensitizing the public. Now in this table, one of the last ones is just to look at who is affected by coral bleaching, but also to think about how would different stakeholder groups respond to coral bleaching, and how do you make the most of the interests of different groups. So we've listed a number of stakeholders on the left: fishermen, tourist operators, local NGOs and researchers, local government and decision makers, and the general public. And you'll be able, this presentation will be available afterwards, so I won't spend a lot of time going through the table right now. But in terms of management actions and what we found with the bleaching response, I think one of the priorities moving forward from this for us as a community, I think, is to really focus on local governments and decision makers. And the reason is that many of the activities that need to happen on reefs, whether it's extending bleaching response plans or interacting with stakeholders and communities, really needs to happen in a framework of the legislation and the guidance and the frameworks that government enables. So I think looking towards these multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approaches to limit stresses in a particular area, to get new guidelines and regulations in local government, and just having stakeholder meetings, I think, will be an important way to gain more support from the government and to get government to be to invest more in bleaching response plans the next time around. And this comes to the final slide, so areas to improve for responding to coral bleaching. I think one of the key things is early preparation, and that needs to begin in December for the following January to May in the bleaching season. And in order to do that, better next year for each program to revise and update your response plans based on what happened this time around, so you can activate it at the end of the year. A big focus could be to increase the number of national institutions implementing bleaching response plans, and the implementation of measures. So if we can activate the country networks, national coral reef task forces or other relevant networks, will really help in this process and bring stakeholders and government together for planning. And that will also improve the collaboration between national institutions and NGOs and communities in this matter. And lastly, this issue of really monitoring bleaching. If we can't do it more regularly, really focus on having some monitoring down at the peak of bleaching and then at the end of the bleaching period. So I think we'll end there. Just finish with acknowledgement to the many contributors that the data that we presented, that Mishal went through, doesn't come from us in CORDIO. We're only involved in one or two of those data collection efforts. So thank you to all of you. And here's the second slide. It's really been a big effort this year, and much stronger concerted effort than ever before. So for that, I think a big acknowledgement as well goes to the Indian Ocean Commission and Syed Ahmed, who's on the call as well, for the support that they've given. And then, yeah, so I think I'll hand the session back to Petra to take us into the questions in the next session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both for presenting. And now we're going to open up the webinar for discussion. So there's two ways that you can ask your questions. One is you can raise your hand on the toolbar that you have. It's the small hand icon to the left of your name. If you raise that hand, and I see some of you have them up if you maybe you have a question already. And so then David and Mishal will be calling on you by unmuting you there. And then they'll call on you and you can just ask your question out loud and they'll answer it. The other option is using the question box where you can, as several of you have already chatted in some questions, and then they'll be able to answer them there as well. So David, you want to start by calling, go ahead and can call on somebody who has their hand up and I can unmute them, or you can go for unmuting them, and we'll see how this works.
Okay, thanks, Petra. For some reason, I can't actually see the attendees in the end.
You can't. Can you click the arrow down?
I can see the staff, but not the attendees.
Oh, really? So you can't see the attendee box. Okay, well, let me call on them for you, and then, yeah. So, so some of you have hands up, so if you meant to, I'm going to be unmuting you, and I'm not sure how to say everybody's name, but is it Bacha Gian? Did you have a question? I think you might be self-muted, but your hand's up, so just wanted to give you a chance to ask your question. If you want to unmute yourself, you should be able to click on that little microphone. Okay. Well, if you want to pop on and do that, I have you unmuted. I think there was another. Okay, so those are the hands up there. Oh, wait, here we go. Here's one more hand up. Peter, let me unmute you. Peter Musimbi, did you have a question? You are
Yes.
Oh, great. Hi. Okay, go ahead and ask your question. David and Mishal are ready.
Hi, David. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Really grateful for the webinar. I think it's been a learning process all through in bleaching and all through monitoring. So there's two things. One is right now we've looked at the impacts of bleaching at the coral level. So the next step at looking at the impacts of bleaching at the ecosystem level, looking at the whole of coral reef, and most of these things, of course, we are constrained by funding. But if we were to look at some of these impacts, because most of them probably they'll need a long-term monitoring. But if we have, to some extent, we can get to the reef maybe even once a month. What should we be looking at? And the second one, it's another thing that has been a problem. I think it's a funding problem. So is there a way to prepare this early enough, both in terms of funding and all those that can be involved, so that by the time we have protocols and we have at least facilitation for most of the people that can be involved? Okay.
All right. Thanks, Peter, for those questions. I think, and thanks for joining the session, in terms of what to watch after the bleaching, I mean, long-term annual monitoring of the same sites is the best thing to do. And once you get into 5 or 6 years worth of data, that's incredibly valuable data set to have. It might be that after the end of the bleaching event, after mortality, if you're very interested, if you go out every 3 months, you'll see a change in the turf and the algal community that's invading over the dead coral surfaces. But I would say that the standard line transect or photoquadrat type techniques are perfectly adequate for moving forward with those on both those scales every 3 months for a year, and then every year after that. If you want to look at coral recruitment, then to use meter square quadrats and to document those in the field, and that may change right after the bleaching event as well. So I hope that's clear enough, and we can take up that kind of methods discussion a bit more on the forum afterwards, because that can get into a lot of details. And then on your second question in terms of funding, unfortunately getting a contingency fund to be able to support different groups with bleaching responses and monitoring is a tough call. We have tried to do that in the past, but then there wasn't a really big bleaching event to sort of motivate the donors and motivate the community. Maybe after this one, with a number of partners, and now we have so many groups that have submitted data this time, we might be able to do better at trying to get a contingency fund that can be activated when there's a bleaching event. So that's certainly something we could look into. But you certainly use it yourselves for whatever funding you can get through your organizations or locally to try and motivate for bleaching response funding.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. If there are other questions, I know there's a couple of questions that have been written down. Benjamin Caban or Melissa, if you want to ask.
Sure, let me unmute Benjamin. Benjamin, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep, we can hear you. Okay, yeah, please ask the question, Benjamin. I'm not sure that other people can see it.
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you. Oh, he was there, but he looks like he went off all of a sudden.
Perhaps Melita.
Sure. Let me call on Melita. Melita, I'm unmuting you. There you go.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Nice, very nice presentation, David and Mishal. Thank you. I was interested in the reasons that you think that the bleaching we've seen this year has not gone to mortality, which is very good news. You put forward 3 very sound reasons. I thought that was interesting, but I did wonder whether there's been any discussion with the wider network on some just my own observations, but very unquantified, that we had much colder water and much stronger winds than we normally do in sort of January, February, March. So we didn't have that very hot period before the bleaching peak months of March, April. And I just wondered if you've got any more information on that.
Yeah, thanks. That is a good question. We haven't really looked into it, to be honest. And I do remember when the year started, noting that the whole region was a degree or so cooler than it normally is, starting into the warm season in January. So that could certainly be a reason, and the stronger trade winds. And also there was a cyclone that sat over Farquhar in southern Seychelles for about 3 days. I think it was in early April, and that punched quite a big cold hole in the warm pool. And so those could all influence, certainly. Now that we have the spatial distribution of reports that we have, and it's quite extensive, we'll see if we can pick out any either local or more regional trends like that.
Yeah, I think that would be very interesting.
Yeah. And it would be good to get any observations from others locally, because there could be quite strong local events that influence the bleaching patterns. So if we could post any ideas about those on the Resilience Forum as well, that would be good. And I'm sure at the end of the webinar, Petra can give a quick pointer to where to do that if you don't already know.
Okay. Can I ask my second question?
Yes, yes, please do.
It was, I think I might have missed it in the slide where you had a long arrow going across. But when is the best time to monitor the mortality? And I know it's a little constrained by did you actually monitor the bleaching first, but I know there's a number of sites where they didn't manage to get there to look at the bleaching, but they might be able to go and look at coral mortality, so recent mortality. I'm just wondering when is the best time for that?
Yeah, so I would say that the best time to look at mortality is certainly within 4 weeks of it occurring, because even at that short time, it can be hard to assign recent mortality to a particular cause or to recognize if a coral has been dead for 4 weeks or maybe for 6 months. And partly because of that reason, it's also really important to try and get the first observation of bleaching in, because when you have a good sense of a site and you've been there recently and you know there was, for example, 40% mortality, you have a much better ability to gauge whether corals that are dead are recently dead from being bleached a short while before, or if they've been dead for longer than that. But I would say that now we're getting up to the maximum time limit. That's basically mortality records should be in by the end of August, really, to be the most reliable. And the next month or 2 months is getting a bit long.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Great. Do you want me to just pick the next question,
Yes,
David?
please.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
please do.
there's one from James Kamula. I'm going to unmute you, James. Maybe.
Hi, James. Karibu.
Oh, wait. Sorry, it's not. That is crazy. I'm having a problem getting the unmuted. That's really strange. I was unmuting with no problems, and now it's not unmuting. David, do you want to answer one of the written questions?
Okay.
There's a couple more coming in, and then I'll work on unmuting.
So Benjo had written a question. On the observations of bleaching and mortality slides, can you get a feel for any bias in reporting? How sure can we be that the proportions reported are close to the reality on the ground? Well, that is a tough question from Benjo. Thank you. So the classes of bleaching and mortality that we've selected have come through a series of other programs, and have been selected partly to help deal with the difficulty of estimating if bleaching mortality is 5% or 15%, or is it 30% or 45%, and putting those into similar classes together. There's always going to be some level of error and bias between different observers, and it depends a lot on the amount of training and preparation that the observers have. Because when you're looking for something like bleaching, you tend to see it, and it is dominant, and you may estimate higher proportions than are really there. But I think many of the reporting groups have pretty good experience, and of course the other issue is that the actual spots selected for observations could be a bit biased, because we're going to look for the sites of bleaching, so you go to the area that has the most bleaching and report on that. So there are certainly biases involved, and we try to reduce those through communications and having more reliable training and materials and manuals and descriptions of the methodology and so on. So that we rely on all the observer groups, of course, to do the best that they can. If we're not, are we able to unmute anyone else?
I'm still working on it, David.
Okay.
Can you do a couple more? There's a lot of written questions.
Okay. Yep.
A couple of those.
Okay, I see another one from Mathilde Facon. And her question is, do you have information about coral genera most affected by bleaching and the genera poorly affected? Do you think there is a different response of genera between sites or even countries? So yes, we did have a field in the form to indicate the genera that are most affected by bleaching and mortality, and we haven't actually looked at that information yet. So we will look into that. I think the results from scanning, the results that came in, there was, from these general observations, it was as more or less expected, with the branching generally being more impacted. But I know that from in-water observations that I did, for example, in my yacht with others, that a cockerel, which normally bleaches a lot more than others, actually had a somewhat lower response to bleaching this time than it has had in the past. And perhaps that's because of the selection pressures in many of the more vulnerable and genotypes being eliminated in earlier bleaching events and some adaptation happening, that they were less effective this time. And we have heard of that from other parts of the world as well. So there are changes in terms of the susceptibility of different genera. I'll take the next question by Lyndon Glasgow. What actions did the governments take in contributing to recovery? Can this be applied to other countries that depend on tourism and marine resources? I think in response to that, Lyndon, there aren't really many actions that can be taken to stop or prevent the bleaching. It's really about responses of how you manage different stakeholders of the process while it's unfolding. We don't have a record of this, and we didn't ask for that sort of information. Perhaps later on, if we have a bit of time in the discussion, there could be some examples of responses that the Petro and her team have collected over time that she could outline. But we didn't record that in this case over here.
David, I'm just trying to make you the presenter again. I'm not sure why the unmuting isn't working. Sorry about that. I'm just trying to see if that sort of frees it up.
Okay, I've accepted.
Yeah, let me just see if that does anything. It was fine a minute ago. So, because there are a lot of people with their hands raised I'd like to call on.
Okay, I'll continue through another.
There we go. Now I have James. I think he should be unmuted. James.
Yes, hello.
Hi, James. Yes, we can hear you.
Hi, David. How are you? And Michelle.
Fine.
Hi. First of all, thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this webinar, and it was quite a good presentation.
Thank you.
My question is that, as for the data on the side of Kenya, especially on the response plan, I could clearly see that Kenya did not have any response plan. Is it because we were not prepared, or what was the cause of that? That's my question. And then the second one is a comment I would like to make, that now the follow-up actions. I think we need to disseminate these findings, especially to those institutions which are supposed to take actions, especially on the need for the preparation. I've seen in the management action plan, these are all to be played by respective institutions. I would imagine here in Kenya, our research institution, KEMFRI, KWS have a role to play, and also the county government, all those who are responsible for managing the coral reefs. I think this also need, besides this, we need to also disseminate these findings so that appropriate actions are taken where necessary, so that as a country we are not left behind, especially in taking actions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think, can you see my slides? I've put up the results from Mainland Territories again. I think Kenya is all the way over on the right, and there was a reasonable response from Kenya. It happened a bit late in the process, but we did have a training session, especially with Kenya Wildlife Service at the beginning of the year, just to re-establish the monitoring methods and so on. So there has been some response, but yes, I think in general it could be stronger and organized more regularly into, for example, what rangers do with the water. And then there was some response from chemistry scientists towards the end of the bleaching event and getting some results. So, but I think this is a key thing where the national coral reef task forces, I think, are very important to bring different government institutions together to identify roles and responsibilities, and then also the contributions of other stakeholders in the whole process as well. Okay, I might move on to.
Yeah, David, you have a question from Mark Egan. Would you like to ask your question? I've unmuted you.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, we can hear you.
Hey, David. Thanks for the nice seminar. Question that I had is actually one of follow-up to this event, because a number of areas have been seeing disease outbreaks, and frequently disease outbreaks can occur even the year after a bleaching event. I'm just wondering if folks in the region are prepared for monitoring corals for disease outbreaks in the follow-on to this.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a great prompt for that. So we haven't made that an implicit plan yet, but there are a number of events in which we could do that. And so, for example, the Indian Ocean Commission is supporting more coral reef activities next year for the network, and it needs to be decided precisely what the focus was. And this year, while we had initially intended to do trainings on bleaching and disease monitoring, in the end, the focus was completely on bleaching. So the focus next year could shift to including the disease monitoring as well. And I know, for example, in the Seychelles, they have a national program there on the outer islands, and building a disease monitoring plan is a big priority for that I'll be working with them on. So yeah, that's a good prompt, and we'll build that into the regional plans as we go forward. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
David, do you want to do some more of the written questions that you have? I don't see any more hands up right now.
All right. Well, we have two questions. One from Fano Montoya Maya. Hi, Fano. Welcome. And one from Danny Cornelio from Madagascar. I'm not going to try and pronounce your last name. But those are both on issues of species resistance and if there's been acclimatization and adaptation of corals to higher temperatures. I would say that there's certainly shifts that are happening. I think it's in many places it's seen that, for example, croppers are not bleaching first like they used to before, or else they're bleaching and recovering. And like we had put on the results slide, if I go to over here, I think it's clear that you know, we have bought some time. I think corals are more resistant in this region because they bleached really badly in '98 and then several bleaching events since then, whereas the Great Barrier Reef, for example, bleached through in the north for the first time this year, and that's why the mortality was so severe, so that it hadn't been exposed to the same level as it had this year. So certainly some change, but how much change that is, I can't really say, and we're running uphill to try and keep up with the amount of temperature stress. Okay, a couple more questions have come through. If I continue, one from Savignan Leblanc. On our reefs at Surf Island and Seychelles, we have seen an increase of black band disease, which seems to only target the bleached Fabia corals. Have you had any similar reports of increased disease in the other observations? So thanks. I think that came in as perhaps as a response to Mark Aiken's question. And so we haven't seen that yet, but we'd love to get more reports on that. And perhaps, moving these observations into the forum, I think the Reef Resilience Forum will help in documenting that and keeping the discussions alive so that other people can respond to them. You also asked a second question. You mentioned August as sort of the reliable limit in which we should send in mortality reports. However, we have still seen some colonies that are still bleached even 19 weeks after initial bleaching, Fabia, Leptoria, and Platygyra. In your experience, are these normal times to have a bleached colony? So yes, that's a good observation. The corals can remain bleached for quite a long time. I mean, it can go even 3 to 4 months, up to 6 months. They remain in a bleached state and then progressively recover. and different species in general will recover at different rates. So that is quite normal, this long after a very severe event, which is what you had in that part of the Seychelles. So in that case, yes, keep monitoring them and try and document when the bleaching finally stops would be very useful. And last question, again from Savigny on recovery of transect studies to look at partial mortality recovery of coral colonies. This is, yes, we've looked at that quite a bit in the past. Corals, you can have full mortality of a coral colony and full bleaching, but you often have just a partial response on different parts of the colony. So being able to distinguish partial bleaching and then partial mortality is very useful. I think if you're going to look at that, then the best thing for you to do is to set up permanent transects and revisit the same corals or mark individual corals so that you can really see what happens with them and understand how that progresses over time. I think we've come to the end of the written questions now. I don't know if there's any more hands up.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any more hands up, David. Did you want to give them another minute to raise any last hands? Or we're right at the hour, but if there's any more questions, we'd love to have you guys ask them while you have David and Mishal on the webinar.
Yeah, we'll take, if there are any last ones. Meanwhile, while that's happening, perhaps, Petra, if you can remind people how to get to the forum, so they can post their questions there, that would be great.
Okay, great. So, so for when you guys want to continue this dialogue, because this is so important, we want to encourage you to continue this conversation on the Reef Resilience Network discussion forum. This is an interactive online community of managers from around the world, but there's a specific group for the Western Indian Ocean. So if you go to reefresilience.org, click on Network tab, you can join the forum, and the questions, if other questions come into us, we'll be posting answers there, and I believe David and Mishal will be sharing some information out through that forum as it's related to bleaching response and continuing this discussion and being available to answer more questions. So it's really easy to join, and we hope you go there and keep talking about this and sharing your resources. And if you're in the Western Indian Ocean, I know there's a lot of interest from managers in other places some are on the phone today and in seeing how people are responding to bleaching. So your lessons are much needed for other regions as well. So David, is there I don't see any more hands raised. Should I go ahead and continue to wrap up the webinar, or would you like to do anything else?
Okay. Well, I'll just say a last thanks from my side, or just to, particularly with the comment from Mark as well on diseases for next year, is that the Indian Ocean Commission does, through the Biodiversity Project, will continue to support some of these network activities and the CORDIO Task Force in the region here. So we will be moving forwards with the forum and then trying to help with bleaching response plans for this next year coming up, because we don't yet know what that's going to be like. So please do stay engaged, and thanks for joining the seminar.
Yeah, thank you all again, and thanks to our amazing presenters. The recording of this webinar will be sent out to the Reef Resilience Network email list tomorrow, and if you're not on that list and would like to be, you can email us at resilience@tnc.org. We also have another webinar coming up on October 19th, Fishing for Solutions, an Introduction to Fisheries Management for Non-Fisheries Managers. So I think that's going to be a really great one. And thanks again for participating. And thanks, David and Mishal.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.